Good day. I want to break apart the reading on love from the road less traveled. Pages 120 to 168. So, of course, the first reading dealt with the definition of love and what love was not. If you recall, Peck's definition of love basically argues that love is extending of the will for the spiritual growth of oneself and in the other. So, in this particular reading, what we want to take a look at is what are the different forms that love takes? So, what Peck would argue is that there are two forms of love. Number one, you got work is a courage, and number two, love is a work. I think I said that wrong. Number one, love is a courage, and number two, love is a work. Oops. So let's talk about the first form of love, the work of attention. How do we do this? So, first, what we have to do is we have to not do something. And that's comprised by the notion of bracketing. So, what bracketing is that you take your preconceived ideas, you take your emotions, and you set those aside. So, maybe you meet somebody for the first time, you don't like them. You set that preconceived judgment. Maybe the last time you were together with somebody, you were really hurt. You try to set that aside, and then you really listen to them, and you're really present to them, and you're able to welcome whatever comes up. That, of course, is not easy to do that. That is difficult to set aside whatever happened in the past, whatever you have going on, so that you can actually live or listen. But if we really do listen, Pack would say that's an act of love. It is simple, but not easy. One of the biggest obstacles to the work of attention is multitasking. What Peck would argue is that this idea that you and I can be on our phone and listen to somebody is a myth. And most psychologists would agree that you cannot do two things at the same time. Bummer. I kind of like to try to do two things at the same time, but it's not possible. What Peck would say is that similar to contemplative prayer, when we have to use an anchor or a word to draw us back into prayer, we also have to do that when we're listening. We're going to expect lapses. We're going to drift off. Our mind is going to be, in a sense, distracted. We have to come back and just know that that's going to happen and try to address it. What he would say is that one of the biggest reasons why we don't listen or we don't do the work of attention is that we're lazy. And I'm guilty of that. So, how do we truly listen then? If those things are working against us, number one is that we want to notice and pay attention to what's going on with the other. What do we learn from their body language? What do we learn from their facial expressions? What do we learn from, in a sense, something like that? And then what we also want to do is we really are trying to understand what's going on with them and also what's not being said. We might want to check out if we're correct in what we think they're saying, and we avoid prejudgments, trying to evaluate or just trying to fix. We just want to be there. So, for example, you might want to say, is this what you mean after they say it? Or I hear you saying, or am I hearing you right? Just to actually check out with what you think you're hearing. And then the person who's speaking, what they could do is they check in with themselves and they say, well, yeah, is that really what I meant? They also realize, is this feeling that I'm expressing kind of appropriate to the situation? And then is this kind? So that is number one, the work of attention. Number two is the risk of loss. What Peck would argue is that anytime change happens, anything, something new takes place, it's really scary. And it feels kind of different and strange. Who would ever want to argue against this as life has been completely upended with the pandemic and COVID-19. So many routines and rituals that I've really valued and loved are gone. And there's always a part of me that's yearning from what I've lost. But what Peck would say is that if you're really going to love, you're going to have to risk loss. And it's not going to be that we're going to be completely absent of fear, but we take action in spite of that fear. We move out against the resistance into the unknown. I know for me, I think about the time when I was right before I was married. I was really afraid um, that my marriage would end in divorce like my parents did. And what I came to the point of is, do I love my wife? Yes. Is there going to be a risk? Yes. Do I trust her? Yes. And so then, even though I still had those fears, I proceeded ahead. One thing that's been helpful and a common suggestion addressing a fear is using death as our ally. Not that they were sadomasochistic, but we think about like when we've attended a funeral, a lot of times our life comes into focus. Um, and we think about what's really important and we let go of a lot of the things that we worry about. One question that's always posed is like, if you don't know what to do in a situation, you might think, later on my deathbed, what will I have hoped that I've done? And that kind of puts a little focus on our life and our discussions. And we're able to really live life more fully. So the third form of love is the risk of independence. And so what Peck would argue is that many adults, people my age, almost 52 years old, have not really separated themselves from their parents. And their parents still run their lives. And this could take examples that they're still living by their hand-me-down political views or religious views, and that they're really still trying to seek their parents' approval. And they really haven't taken their own destiny in their hands. Remember when Thomas Merton in The War Within Us said that life is an agonia, but we have to be the masters of our own destiny. And it's hard work. This process of growing up, though, I don't think is kind of like a one-time event. It's a process. And so we take little leaps and bounds. One example, my own experience is that a couple of years ago, our family car died and it was really clear we needed to buy a new car. So I did the research on Consumer Report. And what was really clear from my research is that the best car for our family with all number of different factors was a Santa Fe Sport. But I was scared to get a Santa Fe Sport because in the family I was raised, there was a rule that you never buy a non-American made car. And so for me to do this was like a little leap into adulthood. It sounds simple, but it's amazing how much uh, fear can rule my life. What Peck would argue is that what if we risk being independent, it's a real act of self-love. We, in a sense, take responsibility for our lives. Another form of love is the risk of commitment. What Peck would say is that there's this transition period where we fall in love and then we step into really loving somebody. And part of that is that we actually have to commit to our own spiritual growth and the spiritual growth of the other person. But this is hard. What he says, it's common for people to want to have all the benefits of love, but not to really make the commitment. And so what people do a lot of times is they desert the relationship or leave the relationship before they have to make the commitment. Or they say they're committed, but they do things to sabotage it. It's kind of like in a lot of romantic comedies, there is the runaway bride who skirts off to avoid the commitment. But we all do that for sure. One of the big things that's required in commitment is that we have to not only entrust ourselves to God, but we have to entrust ourselves to this other person. We have to, in a sense, put ourselves out there and risk being vulnerable and intimate. And that's why it's so scary to make that commitment. The next act of love is the risk of confrontation. And what Peck would argue is that if you're going to really have a genuinely loving relationship, you have to confront the other person. There's a balancing act. You have to be respectful. This person's an individual. They have to have their own path. But then a lot of times we have to take the leadership and confront something. When I was hurt or feeling this way or that way, and we have to put ourselves out there. So Otherwise, what? There's no depth to our relationship. There's no real intimacy. And fights and arguments are really important in loving relationships. We just have to learn how to do it fairly. In a sense, we're kind of, there's a requirement, we have to be humble because there is a great deal of confidence in saying that we confront the person. We're in a sense playing God, so to speak. And so there's a real balancing act. The next act of love is discipline. So there's a misconception that a person who is in control or not just able to balance their emotions isn't passionate. And what Peck would argue is that the passion can run really deep and the person can also be modulating or responsible for their feelings. Um, Feelings require structure. Feelings require, in a sense, an appropriate expression. We don't want our feelings to run our lives. The example that Peck uses in the book is really unfortunate and kind of inappropriate, talking about slavery. But what he's really trying to get at is true, is that we cannot allow our feelings to run our lives. We, in a sense, take responsibility for our feelings. What Peck would also say is that there's a need for discipline and love, is that we're limited. We can only love our capacity, our capacity to love is limited. We can't love everybody. So we have to, in a sense, limit who we're going to choose to love. He would say we have to be realistic. So if you like have a genuine relationship with your spouse and your children, your life is successful. And this discipline is really the only way to true joy. So the discipline brings us the joy, just much like we have to discipline ourselves in order to become free to really love people. The last act of love as separateness. And what Peck is getting at in this one is that a lot of times in our relationships, the people that we're in relationship, they kind of become extensions for us. So they become a form of status for us. And so um, it's kind of like the same kind of status that we might think if we have a beautiful car or a luxury or a wonderful house or clothing, that we're a better person. Well, that we can feel the same way about our, maybe if we have this partner who's beautiful, or even as a parent, if our child is successful, we think that we are somehow successful. And Peck would say that's not really love. That's a form of manipulation. The purpose of marriage and the purpose of these relationships in our communities is that they are helping us on our own journey. So marriage is really about developing holiness within yourself and the other person, and they should deepen our holiness and growth.